Well, hello, ladies. We are back for part 2 of Esther. I am so excited to bring you the end of the story. But first, let's open in a word of prayer. Father, I pray that you would anoint your words and that they would be your words and not my words, and your thoughts, not my thoughts. Father, as always, I pray that your words change us, that we don't change a word, but that your words would flow through us and change our lives. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, last week we left off in our story of Esther. We'd just been introduced to the main villain of the story, Haman. And remember, he's now been promoted to second in command, and his edict was to exterminate the Jews. He was mad at Mordecai. He was mad at all the Jews. Remember, there was a family history with his family, and so he was going to bring his little blood feud forward and get rid of all the Jews. Remember, he had his magicians cast lots, or called Pur, which is what the Jewish people, they celebrate the festival of Purim, which is based on the word Pur. But he had these magicians cast lots to decide the month that would be best to exterminate all of the Jews. And it landed on the last month of the year. Now all he had to do, he was in the first, remember, this is the first month of the year, and all he had to do was take his plan to the king. So if you're going to let's turn to Esther chapter 3, because that's where we had left off our story. Let's turn to chapter 3, and I'm going to read you verses 8 to 15. It says, "Then Haman said to King Xerxes, 'There's a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples of all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from those of all the other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It's not in the king's best interest to tolerate them.'" See, you're going to find out that King Xerxes really didn't have anything against the Jewish people, only Haman, but Haman was pleading his case here. Verse 9, "If it pleases the king," here comes the butter. He's buttering him up. "If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I'll put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business." Now, 10,000 talents of silver was about 375 tons of silver. How was Haman going to get all this money, all of the silver? Well, from the Jewish people, where he would plunder their goods. Verse 10, "So the king took his signet ring from his finger, and he gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. 'Keep the money,' the king said to Haman, 'and do with the people as you please.'" See, you can see that he's just basically, go ahead and do it. I don't really have an opinion one way or the other. You go ahead. But you see how the Bible has described Haman. He has this full description. Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. That's been tagged on as his name. So Haman approaches the king, and he butters him up. You need to be careful when people come to you with flattery and buttering up. They're usually going to ask you to do something that you might not normally do, but then you're all, flush with the praise, and so you go ahead and let them do what they want. Xerxes has a habit of letting people talk him into things. Remember, last week we learned about Vashti, and he got talked into that. But it's interesting that Haman probably already knew that he was going to get what he wanted from the king, because if you go back and notice that when he cast the pur, he cast it in the first part of the first month. And then in verse 12, it says on the 13th day of the first month. There's only 13 days that had happened in that month. We don't exactly know when he cast the pur, but it wasn't that many days later that he had all the royal secretaries ready. He had all of the people, the couriers and everything. He had the dispatchers ready. He had everything ready to go because he already knew that the king was going to say yes. He was going to talk him into it. He was pretty sure of himself. So it says that we go on to read, and it says, verse 13, "Dispatchers were sent by couriers all the king's provinces in order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and little children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so they'd be ready for that day." They have 12 months to think about the day they're going to die. Then verse 15, it says, "Spurred on by the king's command, the couriers went out, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. Then there's this interesting little last part of that verse. It says, the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. What kind of leadership was it that the king and Haman, this was the king and his second in command, and they sat and drank while their whole city was in an uproar? What kind of leadership is that? What kind of leaders were they that they could sit and calmly drink while they've just ripped up their whole province? For the Jews, there didn't seem to be any way of escape. But then our heroine re-enters, Esther. In chapter 4, we read that Mordecai learns of the plot, and he rips his clothes and he puts on ashes, and he goes in front of the palace and he's pacing back and forth. And I'm sure he wasn't quiet. I'm sure he was wailing and mourning because of what had happened. And Esther, who is neatly sequestered in the palace, I mean, it's a great life, but you don't really know too much about what's going on the outside. But she heard from one of her attendants that Mordecai was outside in sackcloth and ashes. And so she sent Hathach to go out and find out what was wrong. So in this 4th chapter, let's go to the 6th verse, where Hathach goes to Mordecai and finds out on behalf of Esther what's wrong with him. It said, so Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and to explain to her. And he told him, so Mordecai told Hathach to urge her to go into the king's presence and to beg for mercy and to plead with him for her people. So Mordecai is specifically asking Esther to intercede for her people and to go before the king. Now, her first response back to Mordecai was to be expected. She said, if I go before the king and I haven't been summoned, he can kill me. And it's not as if he doesn't have a habit of rash behavior. And says he hasn't summoned me in some time, so I'm not certain how this is going to work. This is dangerous. There's a risk in what you're asking me to do. And before you think poorly of Mordecai, he basically raised Esther as his own daughter. He loved her, but he was asking her to be brave. He was putting her in a dire situation, but he knew she was the only one who was going to be able to save them. This brings up a question. Are we raising brave children? Are we requiring them to be uncomfortable at times, or are we rescuing them? Every time something goes wrong, our first instinct is to go in and rescue our children rather than to let them be uncomfortable, let them be in a situation where they have to be brave, where they need to develop that part of their personality. Do we model bravery before our children? Do we model to them how to be brave? I want to tell you a story about Dennis, my husband. He works for AT&T, has for many, many years. And back in the day, they had a company newsletter. And this newsletter came out, and there was article after article about how the employees should be inclusive of the gay and lesbian agenda because they wanted to be inclusive of all employees. And Dennis had just about enough because they wouldn't print any other side but the gay and lesbian side. And he said, if you want to be truly he wrote a letter to the editor of the newspaper. He said, if you want to be truly inclusive, you need to include Christians, and you need to accept Christians because they're your employees too. And he just wanted both sides. He didn't want one side or the other. He wanted both sides heard. They printed his letter, and he got such a backlash. I mean, people wrote in the most vile things in this newsletter, ripping him, calling him names, and accusing him of things that weren't true. And what was interesting is the only support he got were from phone calls from other employees in the company that said, we feel the same way you do, but we don't want to write because we don't want the kind of backlash you're getting. And so they were allowing him to be brave for all of them, but they weren't brave enough to do anything to support him. And he thought, well, I wonder what this is all about. What good did I do? But our children were watching. Now let's fast forward several years. Our daughter Catherine was in high school, And there was a teacher that was pressing in on an issue that flew in the face of Christianity. She was the only one in the class that raised her hand and said, I don't believe that. I don't believe that's true. And of course, high school is a vicious place to be when you have a differing opinion. And she got the jeers and the looks and the snark and, the laughter. She got all of it, and she took it. And after class, one boy came up to her and he said, I believe the same way you do. I just wasn't brave enough to raise my hand. Yep. Model bravery to your children. It's important. Mordecai was modeling bravery to Esther, and Esther picked up the ball. But she thought, what can I do? I'm just one woman. I am just one woman in an entire kingdom. And women didn't have any rights in those days anyway. And she said, I don't know what I can do. The significance of one throughout history gives us the answer of what one can do. If you turn over to Exodus, the 32nd chapter, we find that Moses was up on the hill getting the 10 Commandments. He was up in Mount Sinai getting the 10 Commandments. And while he was gone, he'd been gone too long, and his people got a little restless, and they decided that he wasn't coming back, and they were going to have to figure out what to do on their own. And, of course, they figured wrong, as the children of Israel were wont to do. They always did it wrong. And what they did is they got all their jewelry together, and they melted it down, and they got themselves a little golden idol to worship. And in verse 7, the Lord says to Moses, go down because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. They've been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and they've made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. And they've bowed down to it and sacrificed it and have said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. God was mad. You go down to verse 11, and we see the power of one. Moses, it says in verse 11, but Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. O Lord, he said, why should your anger burn against your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt with the great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, it is with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountain, to wipe them off the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky. I will give your descendants all this land I've promised them, and it'll be their inheritance forever. The power of one, verse 14. Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened. The power of one man willing to stand up. One vote. Did you know in 1923, one vote, one person's vote gave Hitler the power of the Nazi Party? One man, one woman, one vote in the hands of Almighty God. It makes all the difference, all the difference. So Mordecai presses into Esther and asks her again. And here comes our memorable line. Remember I told you the memorable lines we learned from lesson 1? Here comes our memorable lines. Starts in the 4th chapter, in the 12th verse. It says, Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, and he sent back this answer. Do not think because you're in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to a royal position for such a time as this. Wow. Powerful. And it was just enough. So Esther comes back in verse 15, and she replies to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night and day. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I'll go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai reminds me of Winston Churchill. I love Winston Churchill. I love his quotes. I love reading quotes about how he inspired his troops and he inspired his people. There's one fiery Churchill quote that I think fits really good right here. Churchill was encouraging the people during World War II, and he said, "Let us brace ourselves to our duties and so bear ourselves, so that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour." Yep. This was going to be Esther's finest hour. The king may have chosen Esther because she was a looker, but God chose her because she had character. Was she scared? I would have been. I bet she was. Was she determined? Absolutely. Absolutely. See, we know that she became the heroine because we read the back of the book. We know the end of the story. She didn't know. She didn't know if she was going to turn out to be a heroine or a martyr. She didn't know if she was going to be banished like her predecessor Vashti. Could have very well been that he could have banished her to the kingdom because he didn't like what she did. He didn't like her speaking up to him. She didn't know, but she went ahead anyway. But what's interesting is when brought with this major problem, her first instinct was, wait, let's wait a minute. There is a waiting period between chapter 4 and chapter 5. There's a 3-day wait period. We can just kind of move on. We just read chapter 4. We can go right into chapter 5, and we don't even blink. But she waited 3 days. She waited and fasted and prayed. She didn't take action right away. She didn't bull right in. Why the waiting? Well, let's turn to Isaiah. Let's turn to the 40th chapter of Isaiah, and we're going to start with verse 29. It says, "He gives strength to the weary, and he increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall." Verse 31, "But those who hope in the Lord," or another version says, "those who wait on the Lord, will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint." Why the waiting? Because it says we gain strength. Those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. So waiting is important because it's going to make us stronger. It gives us perspective. It says they'll soar on wings like eagles. Sometimes we need to rise above the problem and hover a bit and look at the whole problem because we get so mired, we get so into the forest that we can't see anything because of the trees. But God will bring us up on wings like eagles to soar over the top and to look at the problem as a whole. So we gain perspective. We gain energy when it says they'll run and not grow weary. We might need some energy for this thing that God's going to ask us to do, this problem that we've got to work through. So we're going to need energy, and it says if you wait on the Lord, you're going to run and you're not going to grow weary. And you'll gain perseverance because it says you'll walk and not faint. That's why you wait. That's why you don't just rush right in. When you're confronted with a problem, don't just rush in. Take a second, take a time, and wait before the Lord. Wait and fast and pray and find out what he wants you to do. So Esther waited 3 days. She had everyone fast for her. She fasted and prayed, and then she came up with a plan. Let's throw a 2-day party. And I'm thinking, wait, that's kind of a shallow plan for 3 days of praying, and this is the plan she comes up with? I mean, it seems kind of shallow and superficial here. But wait, remember we learned in our lesson this week, she knew her audience. Xerxes loved to party. So if she's going to ask him for this great favor to save her people and to basically kill her second in command, she's going to need him in a good mood. And because he loved parties, she figured this was the best way to ask. She wanted to carefully present her request to him, and she needed him to have a favorable reply. So let's go to the 5th chapter, and we're going to read the first 3 verses. It says, "So on the 3rd day," see, the 3rd day, after 3 days of fasting and praying, So on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in the front of the king's hall. You imagine she probably gooped up and smelled good too, so that the little smell, she had all that goop stuff from that when she became queen. I'm sure there was leftovers. So here she is standing there. She's probably trembling under that royal robe. Can you just imagine how scared she would be? Knowing, is this the last robe I'm ever going to wear? Is this the last time I'm ever going to see my husband? Is this the last thing I'm ever going to do? She didn't know how this was going to turn out. But she was standing there. She showed up. Sometimes bravery is just showing up. So the king is sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. He sees her right away. Verse 2, when he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her, and he held out his gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Oh, my goodness. This is the smitten guy we talked about last week. There's nothing cuter than a smitten king. And he was smitten, and he says, what is it, Queen Esther? What's your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it'll be given to you. See? He not only was pleased, he was going to be generous. So Esther could have, and I would have been tempted at that point going, what's with the 2-day party? I'm going to have to do dishes, and I'm going to have to cook and stuff, and I'm going to have to face Haman, and I can't stand that guy. Why in the world would I want to have a 2-day party with him? I can just fix this right now. Because, the king's pleased with me, and so I'll just ask him right now. Why didn't she ask him right away? Because he said, I'll give you up to half the kingdom. He was in a good mood. She could have asked him. But God had her waiting. She was in the presence of God. She was in the plan of God. She already had prayed, and she was prepared, and she knew that God said, give a 2-day party. He had plans in place. So she said, if it pleases the king, let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I've prepared for him. Wow. Okay, so we get party 1. And Xerxes and Haman are happy, and they're drinking and having a party. And can you imagine how bad Esther felt? She is serving the person who's trying to destroy her people and her. And she's being gracious and kind because that's what God said to do. That's what she knew she had to do. So then Xerxes, again, with this half the kingdom stuff, he did this several times, offered her up to half the kingdom. If she had been the least bit monetary minded, she might have taken him up on it. But not Esther, not our heroine, not our sweet Esther. So he says, what do you want? Up to half the kingdom. And she said, guess what? I just want you to come back for party number 2. She was playing with him a little bit. She was going to make sure he was fully intrigued. At least that's what he thought. He loved the game, I'm sure. She just knew that God had plans in place that needed to happen before party number 2. So she was using her discretion and saying that she needed to have a second party. She was working on God's timing, not her timing. Because she'd been waiting on the Lord, and she knew that God wanted to set a stage. I need to stop for a minute and talk to you about God's time versus our time. God's time is perfect, and our time is always rushing. We measure time objectively. If we want to know the minute or the hour, we look at our watch. If we want to know the day or the month or the year, we look at a calendar. For us, time is accountable, and we have to live every moment of time. We can't move ahead a minute just because we want to. We're kind of stuck in time. For us, time is accountable. Events are seen and experienced. They're witnessed. We live through them. Events, we even capture events on our phones, on camera. To us, time is always accountable. And people are present in this time. Time is rarely ignored. We can't ignore time unless we're sleeping or the occasional daydream. We have to live every moment of time. We're stuck in it. We're stuck in the time that we're in. None of this is true with God. To him, he transcends time. Time is immeasurable to him. Where we see life as one frame at a time, God sees the whole movie. He was there in the beginning. He already knows the end. He's seen the whole movie. He knows how it's going to turn out. It's kind of like we know how Esther was going to turn out, but she didn't. She was stuck in time. And we only know it because it's history. God knows all of it, the beginning and the end. That's why he can be silent while we squirm, because he already knows how it's going to turn out. God is never late. He is never negligent. And his timing is always perfect. And that's why he had Esther calmly planning party number 2. Because with the fasting and prayer that she did for those 3 days, she had become sensitive to God's perfect timing. And all the while she was in God's perfect timing, Haman is bragging. He goes home and he's all stoked because, he got invited to a party nobody else got invited to, and he was the only guest. So let's look at verse 10 in chapter 5, where he says, calling together his friends and Zeresh his wife. That Zeresh, she put up with a lot from him because all he did was brag and pout. What a husband. Okay. Anyway, Zeresh's wife, in verse 11, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth and his many sons and all the ways the king had honored him and how he was elevated above all the nobles and officials. Have you ever met someone like this, where they drop names and, they're always telling you how much money they have and the kind of cars they drive, and, it becomes tedious. Verse 12, and that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she invited me along with the king tomorrow. If he paused here, he would just be a braggart. But he goes on in verse 13 and becomes the little Debbie Downer we know him to be. He's still whining about Mordecai. So verse 13. It says, but all of this gives me no satisfaction. Can you just see him whining? All of this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. Zeresh had probably just had it up to here with the whining, so she decides to give him an idea. He's obviously not going to come up with any ideas on his own, so she came up with a solution. Build a gallows. She said, build a gallows 75 feet high. Don't you think that's a bit excessive? But then again, she probably just wanted it to be over with. And ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go to the king to the dinner and be happy. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the gallows built. He went, Haman never wasted time. When he wanted to annihilate the Jews, he wrote that edict right away. He had those secretaries ready, went right to the king. Boy, when he has a plan, he moves right ahead. He gets his good plan about the gallows. He had them built that night. That night, between party number 1 and party number 2. Then an interesting little thing happens. An seemingly insignificant event. The king has insomnia. The beginning of verse 6, we find another little interlude that we don't think really fits. Why did the king have insomnia, and why is it important enough to put in the word of God? Because it's all part of God's plan, and he wants to show you that no detail is so mundane as to not be important in God's plan. That's why last week when I said, be careful with your mundane, be careful with your ordinary, because it can be extraordinary in someone else's life. So be careful how you handle your ordinary day. So the king couldn't sleep, so he brought out this book. Remember when Mordecai had thwarted the plot between Bigthana and Teresh, the 2 thugs that wanted to kill the king, and Mordecai heard about it, and he went to Esther, and Esther went to the king, and then Bigthana and Teresh were killed. And all that happened was it was written into some book, some king's book, and nothing ever happened to Mordecai. And what did Mordecai do? He didn't whine about it. He's not Haman. He's not a whiner. He went back to work. Didn't think any more about it. And it was just written in a book. And nothing happens till chapter 6. That was early in the book that we learned about these two guys. And then in chapter 6, it comes back up because the king couldn't sleep, and he thought, if somebody reads to me, I'm sure I'll go to sleep. And so they're reading to him, and they're reading to him about Mordecai thwarting the plot. And he went, wait, does it say anything in there about what we did to honor Mordecai for saving my life? And they went, no, nothing's been done. He went, wait, we need to honor this guy. So he says, who is in the king's palace so that I can get some advice on how to honor him? And in perfect irony, Haman had just come into the king's palace to ask permission to hang Mordecai on the gallows he'd built the night before. So he'd come into the courtyard so that he could ask the king's permission to hang him, because he really thought he could get the king to do anything he wanted him to. And the king comes out and he says, Haman, perfect. What would you do if somebody pleased the king? How do you think I should honor them? And Haman's thinking, who's better to honor than me? Who does he like more than me? I'm second in command. I go to his special parties with his wife. So I'm sure he wants to honor me, so let's make this big. And so he comes up with this, he hatches up this plan about, get a horse that the king's ridden on and a robe that the king has worn, and let someone lead him through the town saying, this is the person that the king is pleased with. And the king went, those are all great ideas. I want you to do all of those and go get Mordecai and lead him through the town. Wait, what? Mordecai? Are you kidding me? But Haman can't back down. This is the king. And he has to go get that horse and get that robe and lead the man that is his mortal enemy, that he hates more than anything in life itself. And he leads him through the town saying, this is the man the king wants to honor. Can you imagine? I just hardly can contain my giggles. It is priceless. He is having to honor the guy that he despises. And now he realizes that getting Mordecai on those gallows is probably not going to happen. So he goes, what's interesting is you go to verse 12 of the 6th chapter, and it says, afterwards, after all this honoring stuff happens, afterwards, Mordecai returns to the king's gate. Mordecai went back to work. His work was at the king's gate. So he went back to work. Okay, well, that part's over. I'm just going back to work. He didn't get he didn't go to his head, and he didn't say, okay, well, now I don't have to work anymore because the king is pleased with me. Now I don't have to do anything else. No, he went back to work. But Haman rushed home, his head covered in grief. And here comes this wife again. And he told Zeresh's wife and all of his friends everything that had happened to him. I mean, it was like he takes everything personally. Suddenly his wife changes her tune, and says, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. She's telling him, be careful. This is God's man. God's name's never mentioned in this book, but boy, he is all through it. And she's going, wait a minute. You better back up the truck here. You better back off. And before he even has a chance to chew on the words that his wife has given him, the king's people come and get him for the second banquet. I mean, now the action's moving faster and faster in the story. So they go and they take him off. But can you just picture for a minute, it doesn't say it in the word, I'm just kind of, embellishing the story. Can you imagine him walking back to the palace and looking at the 75-foot gallows and thinking, what am I going to do with these? What am I going to do with the 75-foot gallows? Irony. Was it irony or God's sovereignty? But then he goes to party number 2. And Xerxes is all primed up. I mean, he'd partied the day before. He was already pleased with Esther, and he'd partied the day before, and now he's partying again. And here's his pretty wife and his best friend, Buddy Haman, and they're going to get to drink and have a good time. And so Haman, starting in verse 7, or chapter 7, verse 1. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther, and they were drinking wine on the second day. And the king says, here he goes with this half the kingdom again. Queen Esther, what's your petition? It'll be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it'll be granted. I don't think he had another line, but he really used that one a lot. And about this time, Esther knew it was time. Everything was in place. This is when she knew she needed to strike, so she drops the hammer on Haman. Verse 3, Then Queen Esther answered, If I found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If we had been merely sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. Xerxes undone. What? Wait. For one thing, this is probably the first time he knew that he was married to a Jewish woman. And now all of a sudden he wants to protect her and her people. And so in verse 5, King Xerxes asks Queen Esther, who is he? Who is this man who has dared to do such a thing? Haman is choking on his grapes, I'm sure, at this point, or his wine, And he's going, uh-oh. Verse 6, Esther said, the adversary and the enemy is this vile Haman. Dun, dun, dun. Can you imagine? I mean, the curtain's fallen on Haman. And Haman is terrified before the king and queen. The king is steamed. He doesn't like to be taken advantage of. He doesn't like to find out that his best friend and second in command is trying to kill his wife and her people. He's mad. So he goes storming out into the courtyard before he drops one of those gold goblets or something and breaks something. So he's stormed off. Haman's decided he's going to plead his case with Queen Esther. Don't you find that interesting? He is begging for mercy from a woman that he wasn't going to show any mercy to at all. He's begging for mercy when he wasn't going to show any mercy whatsoever to her people. And yet he thought he deserved mercy. What was interesting is she was on one of those little reclining couches. And you know how you just kind of fall on, well, I wouldn't, but in those days they were very dramatic, fall on someone and beg for their mercy. Well, about the time that the king is calmed down a little bit and he's coming back into the banquet room, Haman's fallen on Esther begging for mercy, but that's not what it looked like. It looked like he was trying to attack her. And the king went, "Are you kidding me? You are attacking my wife in the palace? What is wrong with you?" And immediately they put a bag over his head. Now, the reason they would put a bag over someone's head is when they are condemned to die, the king is to no longer look at them. And Haman knew it was over. This was priceless. Haman ends up being hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Remember, what we call irony, God calls sovereignty. Now Xerxes needed to do some damage control. So we go into chapter 8, and Esther is begging him, please, if you care anything at all about me, please save my people. And the king already knows. This whole thing, it comes back. Remember, we learned last week that Persian kings were considered gods. And when they made an edict, you couldn't change it. They couldn't even change it because they figured they didn't ever need to. And so he already knew that this was going to work against him. He said, I can't change this back. But what he did say is he says, but I'm going to give the power to Mordecai to make an edict so that the Jewish people can protect themselves. So let's read about the fix. If you turn in the 8th chapter, in the 11th verse, and it says, the king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force of any nationality or province that might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. This is an important part of the line. Remember this part, to plunder the property of their enemies. They had that choice. They could have done that. Okay, so keep that in mind. Verse 12, the day appointed for the Jews to do this in the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month. See, the same day they were going to be attacked. The month of Adar. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemy. Let's go back and talk about vengeance versus justice. They were unjustly targeted, but they were going to be able to avenge themselves. So verse 14 says the couriers go out, they're riding royal horses. I mean, they're getting the fastest horses. They're getting the news out. And the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. Verse 15, Mordecai left the king's presence wearing royal robes of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. He has now been put up to the second in command. The city of Susa held a joyous celebration. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. Now, see, they haven't fixed it yet, but at least they have a chance. These Jewish people were willing to celebrate. And it says, and many people of other nationalities became Jews because of the fear of the Jews had seized them. They realized this is a protected people. This is a people that has God on their side. So the Jews were going to be given the right to defend themselves, but God put limitations on there. God put limitations where it was going to be justice, not vengeance. And there's a difference. Have you ever lost your temper and blasted somebody? And you thought you were justified? Have you ever ate seconds or thirds or fourths at a dinner and you were miserable afterwards? Have you ever let your thoughts run wild and those thoughts took you to a place that you really shouldn't have been and you stayed there too long? Have you ever talked too much and regretted it? You hurt somebody, but you can't take it back. If you've done any of those things, and we all have, you understand the power of limitations and self-control. And God knew that power of limitations and self-control needed to be applied to these Jewish people. In the study that I gave you this week, I quoted Chuck Swindoll describing self-control as the key that unlocks the leg irons of slavery. Slavery to those drives and desires that initially seem to be so freeing and fulfilling. Self-control is to a person what brakes are to a car. Without it, a crash is inevitable. There's an example from the Bible of Joseph. His brothers threw him in a pit and sold him to the first slave trader. He showed mercy to those brothers when he could have shown vengeance. In a world of turmoil, believers need to learn the difference between justice and vengeance. We need to show mercy. There needs to be more mercy and more humility. Micah 6:8 says, He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. If we're going to be different in the world, and we're called to be different, we need to show more mercy than doling out more punishment. We need to act justly, even if no one else does. We need to act justly. We need to walk humbly, and we need to show that humility to other people. We can't point the world to God if we're not going to model him. They're not going to follow us if we're the same as them. So we go on in the 9th chapter, and on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, it came out and there was an attack. And it says, the Jews struck down, verse 5, the Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them. And they did as they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed the 10 sons of Haman and the enemy of the Jews, but they did not lay hands on their plunder. Remember when I said they could have? They had the choice, they could have. And it says, those slain in the citadel of Susa were reported to the king the same day. And they went on, it says in verse 16, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay hands on their plunder. They did not take what they had every right to take because they had self-control. They were exacting justice, not vengeance. So to recap our story, we got bad guys hanged. We have Bigthana and Teresh and Haman. So they're gone. They're hanged and they're out of the story. And the good guys win. Mordecai's exalted and the Jews are protected. Hearts are changed. Xerxes now realizes the Jewish people are not the bad guys that Haman said they were. All because God is always present and always in control. Man, we need to be more like Esther. We need to show that graciousness and that patience. We need to be brave. We need to be willing to risk it all for the cause of Christ. Don't be so quick to bail when God seems absent in your life. Some of the greatest things happen in the waiting time. I found an article from a woman named Jennifer Burkhalter, and this is just part of what she wrote. She said, I would have pulled Esther out of being snatched from her only family, out of being placed in a position where she never asked for, out of the path of a vicious, power-hungry foe. I would have cheated people out of a woman God could use to save their very lives. And oh, friend, I want to pull you out. I want to change your path. I want to stop your pain. But right now I know that would be wrong. I would be out of line. I would be cheating you and cheating the world out of so much good. Because God knows. He knows the good this pain will produce. He knows the beauty this hardship will grow. He's watching over you and keeping you in the midst of this. He's promising you that you can trust him, even when it all feels like more than you can bear. So instead of trying to pull you out, I'm lifting you up. I'm kneeling before the Father and asking him to give you strength, to give you hope. I'm asking him to protect you and move you when the time is right. And I'm asking him to help you stay prayerful and discerning. I'm asking him how I can best love you and be a help to you. I'm believing he's going to use your life in a powerful and beautiful way, ways that will leave your heart grateful and humbly thankful for this road you've been on. So stop squirming. When God has you in a place, stop squirming and wait on him. So don't be quick to bail when God seems absent. Don't be fearful when God seems silent. He's not silent, he's waiting. Ben Patterson wrote a book called Finding Hope When God Seems Silent. And he said, the prayer that wrestles with the living God has the faith to believe in the end that even the apparent silence of God is the silence of his higher thoughts, and that his no is spoken, that he might give us a more resounding yes. Wait for God's yes. It's the best yes. And remember, you've been put where you are in your position for such a time as this. Be brave and wait on God and be like Esther. Amen.